the left lobe is involved in verbal memory for words and names. So if you meet a new person and and then they go away and then they come back and you try to remember their name, but you recognize them. So if you recognize them, that means your right lobe is working just fine, and if you can't remember their name, then your left lobe is not working as strongly. I can certainly relate to that one. So the next lobe is our temporal lobe, which is at the back of the head here, and it has a specialized region called the visual cortex, which receives information directly from our eyes and specializes in decoding visual information. It's also responsible for decoding form, color, and movement. So by combining visual and remembered images, this allows us to recognize and identify objects. The next region is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is also known as the little brain, and it's located at the very back. If you see in that slide that lower region, which is kind of pink, sort of purpley pink, that is the cerebellum, and it's responsible for the regulation and coordination of movement, posture, and balance. And finally, we have the brainstem, which is at the very bottom. It's the simplest part of the human brain, the oldest part, and it is the extension of our brain, and it's the connection point between the brain and the body via the spinal cord. The functions necessary for survival that it's responsible for are breathing, digestion, heart rate, and blood pressure. Okay, so now I just want to talk briefly about our hemispheres. So our hemispheres refers to the parts of our brain, which I just talked about. I talked about the lobes, but now I'm going to look at the brain from a different perspective, from one side to the other side. And so we've got our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere. They're divided equally in half down the center, and there's a tissue, white tissue called, or white matter called the corpus callosum, and that's what allows our right and left hemispheres to communicate seamlessly. The functions of the right and left brain hemispheres are quite different, kind of opposite, you could say. The right side is more of the creative 3D big picture thinking side. It synthesizes information, it looks at the whole picture, it controls our imagination, our intuition, it's holistic in thinking. It organizes things in groups, so it will say, oh, okay, so that's a chair, I recognize that as a car, I recognize that as a house. And in contrast to that, the left brain is more logical. It thinks more in parts. It will, as the right brain says, oh, that's a chair, that's a house, that's a car, the left brain will say, oh, that's Peter's car, that's Susie's chair, and so on. So it tends to be more analytical, logical, objective, systematic, and so they are quite different. Interesting to note that because most people tend to be right-handed, and so if they're right-handed, that's being controlled. Oh, yes, I didn't mention that the hemispheres are contralateral in how they control the rest of our body. So our right brain controls the left side of our body, and our left brain, our left hemisphere, controls the right side of our body. So, and that's why, because most people are right-handed, that means that their left hemisphere is controlling their movements, and that's why most people who have strokes will have stroke on their left side, because most people are right-handed. So another area that I'd like to talk about is the nervous system. That's a really important system that I have to just kind of go over very briefly here. But it's basically our nervous system is what allows our brain to communicate with the rest of our body. And it's basically made up of nerves that travel from our brain, and that's what creates our spinal cord. The spinal cord is really a super fast highway that sends messages to and from the brain. And as you can see from that slide, there are different nervous systems, and they each have very specific functions. So I'm just going to go over them very briefly. The peripheral nervous system, actually I want to go back to that slide for a second. So we've got the nervous system, as you can see the top. So the nervous system is divided up into the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the central nervous system, as you can see there, is what includes the nerves of the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is what connects our brain to our limbs and our organs. So I just wanted to say that. Now we can go over to the next one. So again, it's just repeating what I just said. So the central nervous system controls our brain and spinal cord, or rather it includes those areas. And the peripheral nervous system, which includes the somatic and autonomic, is what connects our brain to our limbs and organs. The peripheral nervous system, as I said, has two branches, the somatic and autonomic. The somatic controls the movements of our limbs right here, and our so the somatic, yes, let's go back here to this one. Okay, so the peripheral has two nervous systems, the somatic and the autonomic, and the somatic controls the movements of our limbs. It transmits pain, touch, temperature, and position. The autonomic nervous system regulates most of what happens in our body automatically, especially with response to emotions. It controls the functioning of our organs and muscles without our awareness, because the functions are voluntary, or rather are involuntary. You don't notice when your blood vessels are changing size, for example. It regulates, the autonomic nervous system regulates our heart rate, our blood pressure, digestion, breathing, or the release of hormones. So there are two branches of the autonomic, very important branches, and one is called the sympathetic, the other is called the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic, on the right side of that slide, is represented there, and it allows our body to deal with stress or perceived threat to survival, either psychological or physical, and that nervous system triggers our fight or flight response. So when we feel really nervous or scared or angry, it's that nervous system that is working, and we experience increased heart rate, sweaty hands, increased adrenaline. The parasympathetic, in contrast to that, returns our body back to a more relaxed state, more calmer state. And that's when our parasympathetic nervous system is working. It's also known as the rest and digest nervous system, because that is when we're able to digest our food. That's when blood is mostly in our large organs to digest food. You don't want to eat your food when you're in your fight or flight response. How do we know when we're feeling calm or agitated? Well, that part of our brain that's responsible for processing our emotions is called the limbic system. It's sometimes called the emotional brain or the fifth lobe. The limbic system sits right in the center of that cauliflower, right in the center of our brain, actually, and it sits above the brain stem. And considering the size of it, which is about the size of a walnut, it's packed with functions critical for human behavior, and survival.